We're calling our mission Inspiration 4. It's the first all civilian mission to space. And given that significance of that first, we're trying to be incredibly thoughtful about the people that are going to join us and represent us on this mission as part of the crew, as well as the organizations that we want to benefit from this effort, which is why we selected St. Jude Children's Research Hospital to be the charitable beneficiary of Inspiration 4. This is a significant first step towards a world where everyone can go and explore amongst the stars. One of the things we hope to accomplish and why we named our mission Inspiration 4, to inspire others to be able to do extraordinary, maybe even unthinkable things like go out and venture amongst the stars today, but also to inspire people what's possible that can still be done here on Earth. And if we can accomplish all of that, then we sure as heck better have tackled childhood cancer along the way.
Hello and welcome. My name is Michelle Larson, and I'm President and Chief Executive Officer of the Adler Planetarium. The Adler, physically located in Chicago, has a global mission to connect people to the universe and each other under the sky we all share. It is my pleasure to be a part of this program offered by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs today. Thanks to everyone, and a special shout out to our council members for joining us for this conversation on the future of the space economy. Before we get started, please note that the Council is an independent and nonpartisan organization, and it takes no institutional policy positions. The views expressed by participants in today's program are their own. If you have questions for the panel, we will be taking questions via ccga.live. Simply enter ccga.live into your browser and follow the on-screen prompts. You'll also be able to submit or vote for your favorite question there, and our panelists will address questions later in the program. I'd like to now welcome our panelists to the conversation. Brian Bender is a senior national correspondent at Politico, where he focuses on the Pentagon, NASA, and the defense and aerospace industries. And Chris Davenport is the NASA and space industry reporter for the Washington Post's financial desk, as well as author of The Space Barons: Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and the quest to colonize the cosmos. During the program, we will also be hearing from two of today's SpaceX Inspiration 4 mission astronauts via video, Cyan Proctor and Chris Zembrowski, and they will have pre-recorded messages to inform the topics of today's discussion. Again, welcome to everyone. We are delighted you can join us. Today, SpaceX will make history with the world's first mission to send an all-civilian crew into space, and they will orbit the Earth for 3 days. To begin our discussion, let's hear from astronaut and mission specialist, Chris Zembrowski.
I think we had a big goal in the 60s of being the first to put boots on the ground on the moon, and that's almost all that we did, and that was all the excitement that was put behind it. That was the goal, and so all these energies and all these resources were put into that singular focus of we are going to get people on the moon, and we are going to take a picture, and we're going to come home and say we won. I don't think saying we won advances society in the most meaningful way. I think there's some great competition to be had for sure that will encourage, lots of good innovation. But I think if you look beyond and say, okay, there's this opportunity to expand what we can do in space as a society, as humanity, get beyond what those political competitions are, then you've got a greater opportunity to really develop something new and exciting that's going to be everlasting and have a huge imprint on how it affects the rest of humanity.
Chris here speaks about global competition as a primary motivator for space exploration, and he shares his desire to see more focus on the benefits that result from it. Brian, I wonder if you could speak to us a bit about global competition and the role it has played and could continue to play in the space economy.
Well, I think there's no doubt that it's not the only thing that's driving all of the innovation in the space economy and the investment, but you can't talk about the space race, so to speak, without accounting for the competition, not just the private industry competition, who's going to put up the best satellite, who's going to corner a new part of the market, but also the competition between nation states. I think it's interesting if you look at what SpaceX is doing and some of these other commercial space companies, they've made breakthroughs in technology and they've gotten the cost down for getting to space, but they're primarily still relying on technology that was developed decades ago in order to get to space. And I think that's interesting because it shows that this latest kind of version of the space race, I think, is very much driven by competition. We want to get there before other countries. We want to get there before the Chinese. And so, I think the point that Chris makes in the video, I think it is interesting that, there's so much focus on the competition between countries, but there really is a push to try and talk more broadly about why are we doing this? What is the benefit of it? It's not just about East versus West.
Thank you. Chris, speaking of the competition and the relying on technology that was created a long time ago, to Brian's point, I'm curious about your thoughts on how we can use the motivator of competition to help us realize that investment now in these types of activities pays off into the future, that we have long-term benefits if we take the time to invest in doing big things like what's happening today. What are your thoughts on that near-term versus long-term?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. One of the things, particularly about space investment, that, in the early days, or even just say 5 years ago, the saying was the quickest way to become a billionaire in space was, or the quickest way to start out to become a millionaire was to start out as a billionaire, because you were going to lose money. And it was funded really by people with a sort of long-term vision, willing to sustain losses for a long period of time, which is, Jeff Bezos's mantra with Blue Origin. And that's how it was with Amazon as well. So I think having that long-term vision is crucial. At the same time, when we talk about the business side, a lot of these investors that are fueling this renaissance in space investment are going to want some shorter term returns on that. The government, of course, that's sort of a different factor. And I do find it interesting. I mean, going back to this point of competition, particularly between nation states, is you had the Trump administration, obviously very conservative, very hawkish, take a very hard line on China and almost trying to recast the Cold War space race that we had against the Soviet Union that drove us to the moon during Apollo, and cast that as, sort of a new space race against China. In comes the Biden administration, and you hear from the new NASA administrator, Bill Nelson, former senator from Florida, wrapping his arms around that vision and also casting this as a real race with China as well, and saying that we need to get there. So you have the sort of long-term continuity, or at least long-term in terms of politics and changing of administrations, of embracing that ethos.
Interesting. Thank you for that perspective, both of you, about how the competition provides the necessary impetus, but that can also provide a overarching continuity between different short-term political interests that keep us moving in the right direction. It's very interesting. Along those lines of thinking about how we can move in a good direction, we heard a bit from Chris, and also in the opening video from the mission commander, that we want to think about how venturing out into space can also benefit work that we need to do here on Earth. And so I'd be interested in each of you sharing your perspectives on this idea about also, that we are exploring space, but we are also pushing ourselves so that we can make progress here on Earth. Brian?
Well, I think you can't really talk about one without the other. I mean, I think there was a time where you could have that debate: should we go to space? Should we explore space or not? We need to focus here where we live. I think space is so sort of instrumental now in our daily lives. Our economy, whether it's navigation satellites that do so many things that sort of make the world run, whether it's weather satellites, whether it's tracking climate change. There's so many things now that we're doing in space that have direct implication to life on Earth. So I think that sort of debate is already taken place. In other words, it's both. There's things we're doing in space for the sake of exploration, for the sake of knowledge, for the sake of growing the space economy. But part and parcel of that is that a lot of these investments in space are to improve things here on Earth, not just the economy, but the way of life of everyday humans, to include connecting the world and areas of the world to the internet that are not connected right now. And so I think it's all part of the same goal. And I think you're starting to hear space leaders talk more and more about that. To your initial point, I think there's very much this belief that the public needs to understand, not just the American public, but the global public, why this investment is so important and why it affects you. It's not just some sci-fi vision of sending billionaires to space. It's about improving life on Earth.
Yeah, thank you. Excellent points. Chris, your thoughts about this interconnectedness and this intertwining of space and Earth and challenges there and here?
Yeah, no, I think Brian makes an excellent point. I mean, when you're on your iPhone and that little blue GPS dot that's telling you where to go, it comes from a satellite in space. I mean, if you think about, just the national security implications, missile defense, missile warning, that all comes from space. The sort of timing that goes into a banking transaction comes from space. And what you're seeing now is this move to really embrace that. And just as the technology for computing has shrunk, so we used to have these mainframe computers that took up an entire room. Now, it's as big as your iPhone that you can fit in your pocket. Same things happen with satellite technologies. They used to be a size of a school bus, cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Now you've got satellites as small as a loaf of bread that have amazing capabilities to, as Elon and SpaceX and Amazon are trying to do, put up constellations, not just of dozens, not just of hundreds, but literally thousands of satellites blanketing Earth orbit to beam the internet down to those estimated 4 billion people who don't have access to broadband. I mean, that could really be revolutionary. So, and I think Brian was alluding to this too. There's something of, space is so integral to our lives, and yet there's, something of a PR messaging problem that the space industry, frankly, I think needs to be much better about talking about, how they're connected and how one benefits the other.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, kind of the realization of it for those that are doing it, and as well as the communication of it for the broader public that we're trying to help understand the evolution. Thank you both for your remarks on that. In addition to these topics, we've been discussing about global competition and life on Earth and helping progress here. We see also a real ramping up of the private investment in humans discussing and their realization of the work to be done and also the responsibility to communicate how that helps. As we know, we've got Jeff Bezos with Blue Origin, Richard Branson at Virgin Galactic, Elon Musk, SpaceX, among others that are all in this mix. So we're going to return to a video from Chris Zembrowski, an astronaut on today's mission, to hear his thoughts on this private investment landscape in space exploration. We'll be right back.
I think the private space industry really just feels right now a great sense of obligation to make sure that whatever missions or rockets or launches happen, that they are completely successful. There is nothing more visible in the public eye than a vehicle launching up above the ground. I mean, you can see the Falcon 9 launching from hundreds of miles away, if not thousands in some cases, depending on the time of day and weather. But it is very visible, and so you want to make sure that you keep your rocket safe and operating as expected, or whatever vehicle you choose to use, and that whatever passengers are flying are the best equipped and the safest and have everything they need to be successful. There are so many people watching each and every rocket launch these days, and there have only been less than 600 people that have ever been into space before, that such a small group has such a big impact on anybody else coming behind them. So I think the role that this private industry is playing right now is the one they're supposed to be playing, is that they are excited and they're motivated, and they are the innovators that will make space travel more accessible for the rest of humanity.
We heard here Chris's feeling of a great sense of obligation for the private spaceflight industry to be completely successful, in his words, because of the great visibility that the public eye has on these activities. And certainly the obligation to safety goes without saying. It is an enormous responsibility to be completely safe. But this is inherently risky business, and complete success, as we know from past spaceflight happenings, is not always achievable. The crew and all astronauts on any mission accept that risk and still choose to go to push us forward. So, Chris Davenport, I think I'll start with you, and I'd like to hear your thoughts around this risk, the inherent risk of space travel versus the rewards, and how does the risk and the acceptance of risk really push us forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm at Cape Canaveral right now. We were with the Inspiration 4 crew yesterday at the launch pad, pad 39A that SpaceX operates, and we talked about this. And they're well aware of the risk, and SpaceX is too. And I think they ultimately come to the conclusion that the risk is worth it. But I'm glad we're talking about that, because I think, particularly in popular culture, and as space is sort of re-entering the mainstream public consciousness again, it tends to get romanticized. I mean, it's very inspirational and it's very hopeful, but the fact of the matter is, it is very, very dangerous. When you're sitting on top of a rocket, it's a controlled explosion. It's like a bomb going off. All of those hundreds of thousands of gallons of propellant that are highly combustible. Space is an unforgiving place. It's trying to kill you at every moment. And that, people need to be aware that this is really dangerous. I mean, at the dawn of the space shuttle era, NASA, sort of caught up in the success of Apollo and looking forward to shuttle, thought they were going to be flying shuttle 50, 60 times a year. That's why they called it a shuttle, and that it was going to fly so frequently that they would not be able to fill all the seats with the professionally trained astronaut corps, and they would be able to open it up. And they even had a task force that looked into, well, who should we fly? Who should we give the first seats to? And the answer was a teacher, then it was going to be a journalist, then it was going to be probably an artist. And of course, the teacher was Krista McAuliffe, who was killed in 1986 when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded, which was, I think a real reminder, and a tragic reminder to everyone, just how dangerous this is. But I think SpaceX feels a real responsibility, because they're sort of going first in a way, or standing on those shoulders to prove that they can do it reliably and safely. But there is a huge risk involved.
Brian, thoughts on the acceptance of that risk by those that go, and what they're doing to take risk and being willing to push our understanding and exploration forward?
Well, I think all of us who cover this world are in awe, quite frankly, by some of the individuals who have come forward. Private astronauts, in the case of this mission today. In other words, they haven't gone through years and years and years necessarily of the training that NASA astronauts did. I think where, though, the risk question comes in, though, and remains a little bit unanswered, is whether or not the public or the Congress or investors, God forbid there is another tragic accident, are going to stick with it. And so I think talking about the risk and making sure that people do understand that, if you're going to make an omelet, you're going to probably break some eggs. I'm not so sure that we're prepared for that yet. I mean, we all hope it never happens. but history shows that it can, and it very well may. And so I think that's what that's where I think the risk question, the safety question comes in, is as these innovators, these pioneers are really pushing the envelope, trying to prove that more humans can go to space, stay there longer, and things are going to go wrong. Is there going to be that willingness to stick with it and realize that, yeah, this is a dangerous business, and if we're going to reach all of these goals, we're probably going to have to pay some cost, and some of that cost might be a human life, unfortunately.
Do you think there's a difference in the acceptance of the risk if it's private exploration, privately funded exploration versus public? Chris had, gone through the NASA tragedies and the public exploration phase. Now we're in a public-private partnership, but I'm curious about Congress, investors, the public in general, if you think there's a difference between public and private taking that risk.
Yeah, so what Brian raises a great question, because that's yet to be seen. You think people climb Mount Everest all the time, and they pay a lot of money to do that in some cases, and they're literally stepping over the bodies of people who have been entombed on Everest, and yet nobody's shutting down Everest, and the public seems to be okay with that. If there is an accident, what is the public's reaction going to be to that? Now, let's not forget, we had this in a sense with Virgin Galactic, where they had a flight in 2014, I believe, that went awry, and one of the test pilots was killed. And so then you look at that and you say, well, this was a test pilot, he's pushing the envelope. But if it's a paying member of the public, what does the FAA jump in? Does Congress jump in to sort of have stricter regulations? You're actually starting to see a little bit of this with where Peter DeFazio, chair of the Transportation Committee, has come after the FAA, which has a dual mandate in terms of regulating commercial spaceflight. Yes, they issue the launch licenses, but they cannot regulate the safety of the passengers. Their license protects people and property on the ground, but space tourism is treated like bungee jumping or parachuting, that you sign a form, a waiver that says the risk is high, and you're allowed to go. In addition to that, the FAA's dual mandate is not just to regulate the industry, but to promote it, to help American industry, the aerospace industry, take off. And he's got some real concerns about that. So I think if there is an accident, that you will see some reaction from Congress.
Brian, thoughts on that? The public investment in space versus the private investment in space and the public's tolerance of that risk?
I mean, I would tend to think that the public might have a tolerance for this, in the sense that, I think they understand innately that this is dangerous. And if it is private individuals that are doing it and it's not taxpayer dollars, maybe it's just written off as sort of the cost of doing business. I think on the investor side, there's sort of a bigger question. If the investment community starts to believe, wow, this is really risky, all these big goals that they want to achieve are really in question, or could go up in smoke, literally, is there sort of a pullback in the investment community? I think that's probably the big question in my mind. But I can't help but think in all of this also that while we're so focused on the human space flights and so focused on the billionaires and the space tourism, I'd be interested what Chris thinks about this. But I think in the grand scheme of things, if you look at investment in space and this big push for developing more space systems to help us here on Earth, the vast majority of it doesn't involve any human beings at all. In fact, I think it sort of gets a lot of attention, understandably, because of the risks, because of that sort of romanticism about humans exploring the stars. But much of the investment and much of the technology development is actually for systems that are never going to carry a human. They're going to be robotic systems. They're going to be satellites. And I think we're really still at the beginning of proving what humans can really do in space over the long term. Space is a really, really harsh place, and it's not really well designed for humans. And that's the whole idea of going to the moon and setting up a base and basically starting to experiment with how do humans live, in this very high radiation environment, where, as far as we know, life like ours doesn't exist. So I just think it's important to keep in mind that when we talk
Yeah.
about space investment, a pretty small part of it is actually about sending people up there.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And it kind of speaks to that play between the intellect and the mind and what we're opting to accomplish versus the heart and the imagination and the real wonder that inspires us to want to do more. And both are interwoven into society's progress. But you make a very good point about that. It's a great segue into our next astronaut video, because it is about bringing our culture and our perspectives to the space race and to the exploration. Whether it be technology that gets much done, it is still the people and the imagination and the push from all of us that gets us there. So we're next going to hear from one of today's astronauts, Cyan Proctor, who speaks to the fact that the inspiration for crew and all civilian crew is a representative crew. And so she, being the first ever Black female spacecraft pilot, has some words for us about representation in space.
As the private industry really becomes the leader in human spaceflight and exploration, it's really important that they keep a Jedi space in mind, that just, equitable, diverse, and inclusive space. For me, I think of growing up and watching Star Trek and just wanting to live in that world where a Jedi space exists and it's perpetuated and it's a part of who we are and our culture. And I think that the private industry needs to be the leaders in this space. They need to take this on as part of the mission of advancing human spaceflight. And if they do, just think of what we'll be doing in 5, 10, 15, 50, 100 years, what humanity will be doing. We will have that Star Trek generation. I mean, it's exciting.
Cyan speaks here of leadership in human spaceflight and exploration, going hand in hand with leadership in creating a just, equitable, diverse, and inclusive, or Jedi, space workforce. Brian, why don't we start with hearing your thoughts on the importance of the space exploration industry broadly representing society and the talents, the potential, the perspectives of humanity as we go into this work of looking to go up to space?
Well, I think as the father of two middle school age daughters, I think in some ways it's the most important piece of this. On the one hand, there's clearly the technological innovations and all of the great, amazing things that these companies want to do in space. But I think on a human level, I think inspiring young people to want to go into science, to want to go into engineering. We have a lot of really tough problems to solve here on Earth. And I think if space can capture the imagination, not just sort of your old traditional group of people, but young women, young men of all walks of life, and they can, be inspired to go into some of these disciplines, I think it's going to help humanity. And so I think in some ways on the sort of macro level, the space race and the interest in it and the excitement that it generates, if that translates into a new generation of young people wanting to get involved, whether it's going to space or whether it's just, working down here on Earth to do something in the space industry, I think it's going to have huge implications going forward, not just for the United States, but for countries around the world. So I think you can't overstate how important translating that interest into truly inspiring and training a new generation, a diverse generation of young people to go into this field is going to be hugely beneficial.
And thank you for those remarks. And they bring with them a range of needed talents and perspectives that perhaps have not been at the table in this next exploration phase into space. Chris, your thoughts on, it's almost a question of not knowing what we don't know, because we haven't had a range of perspective in the past, and we want to have more people at the table, to Brian's point, inspire more people. But really the end goal is that they bring with them the talent they possess, the talent that we need to do the next big thing. Your thoughts on how we realize that we need all of that, how it is going to move us to solve problems that we maybe don't even know how to solve or what they are to solve, if we can get more participants in the game.
Yeah, so NASA and the astronaut corps for decades had been dominated by, white men with crew cuts and who had been trained by the military. If you look at, the Mercury 7 through Gemini and Apollo. And today, frankly, the astronaut corps, it's more diverse, but it's not representative of America. And I think they are working to address that. NASA as a whole has problems, as does the whole aerospace industry, in hiring and promoting and creating an equitable environment for women and minorities. They're aware of it and that it's a problem. And so that's why you see, for example, under NASA's Artemis program, which is a return to the moon for the first time since Apollo, NASA has said that the first 2 astronauts to walk on the lunar surface for the first time since a human has done that since 1972 would be a woman and a person of color. And they are working to build a more diverse astronaut corps. What you see now too is on the commercial side. And people like Sirisha Bandla, who flew on Virgin Galactic's flight, and Dr. Proctor now flying on this. And she talks openly about being the first African female pilot to pilot a mission, and the 4th African-American woman to ever go to orbit, which are, significant milestones that should reverberate. And hopefully we get to the point where it's no longer news. That's just the way it is. But unfortunately, we're not there yet.
Yeah, and it's necessary to take these steps to both of your points, that we point out and note when we are having role models who are breaking these barriers and doing this work, so that others may feel inspired. But as we push through it no longer being news, I think there's some work to be done at acknowledging what they bring to the table as participants in this exploration that is additive and additional to the single perspectives that we may have been having before. Brian?
If I might just add one thought too, I think the real test though will be, and it's hard to measure this in the short term, but whether that diverse astronaut corps, whether these role models truly translates into real opportunities within these companies, within the space industry, beginning all the way at the beginning, when it comes to educational opportunities and internships and all the kinds of things that people of color and minorities who maybe have not had a chance to do really will have a chance to do. Because if it's just role models, but it doesn't really translate into changing the system that Chris just referred to, which has been wired a certain way for a very long time, then I'm not sure we're going to move the ball very much. So I think a lot of executives are very aware of this. I think a lot of government officials are aware of this. It's not just the role models. That's the start, and that's important. But there's a lot that needs to follow if you're really going to change the way we do business and the kind of people that we bring into this.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. Harkens back to our beginning conversation around how all the work that we're doing to go there needs to circle back and benefit the challenges we have here on Earth. And you both spoke very articulately about how it is intertwined. And so I hear you saying, Brian, let's not forget that representation in these big things like space exploration should also be intertwined with improving the systems here on our own planet to gain more access for people into any path that they want to take. It's a very good point. I'm going to take a few minutes now to answer questions from the audience. In front of me, questions that have been coming in throughout the program. So we'll take about 10 minutes here and work through some of those questions, which should prove to be good conversation. One of the top questions that's being asked is for you each to speak on how the work of SpaceX and Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, these companies that are taking these opportunities. Can you talk about how, sorry, I've had to read the question again. Can you tell us about how these opportunities in low Earth orbit might contribute to future opportunities to Mars and the moon, or to put those in order, to the moon and then Mars? So how is the progress that we're making in low Earth orbit going to translate into getting us to the moon and then on to Mars and further?
Sure, I can take that. And you're seeing it, even if you take a step-by-step approach, Jeff Bezos would say that it begins in suborbital space, and just launching his suborbital New Shepard rocket just to get the launch cadence up and to practice and to send people up, even though they're just going, 100 kilometers and then coming straight back down and going, Mach 3 as opposed to Mach, 25. But that's good practice. And then that can scale, and then you get a bigger rocket that can go to orbit. And, we've sort of used the International Space Station as a stepping stone, and having someone who's lived up there for nearly a year. And now they just announced that astronaut Mark Vande Hei is going to be extended and may break that record. And, that's sort of the next approach, and then moving on to the moon and Mars. You can think of it too, of the difference between exploration and sending up rockets and sending those covered wagons out west and scouting missions and testing out the terrain and testing out how it, the humans interact with it. And then you move from exploration to expansion, where you hold the territory and you're living there and you're creating a base on the moon. And I think that that's sort of the logical approach. That's the one NASA's taking. That's what SpaceX and Blue Origin and these other companies want to do.
Yeah, Brian, thoughts?
I mean, I think Chris is right. I mean, this is all about kind of one step at a time. And, low Earth orbit, there's an explosion, obviously, in activity up there, mostly not involving people, mostly satellites. But obviously, to launch all those satellites, you're perfecting the process, and, having astronauts spend more time in space, I think, is going to be key to really get a better sense of the physiological, biological challenges that face us and face humans that are going to want to go further and further to the moon, not just to land on the moon and say, I was here, but to stay for some extended period of time. And then, of course, from there to Mars. I think a lot of people use the analogy of the Wild West. And some people don't like that because they think of images of sort of taking over territory and exploring it and, stealing the resources. But I think in many ways, the analogy is used because really what space exploration is very much like exploration of the Wild West was. You have to figure out how to live off the land. You can't take a lot with you. And so if you're going to go further and further and further into space, it very much is like the covered wagon. You're going to have systems and very innovative ways to sustain human life up there with not a whole lot to work with. And so I think that's the analogy. It's not, somehow we're staking new territory and we're going to take it for our own. It's more this step-by-step approach, figuring out how do we go further out? How do we stay out there longer and not die? Because, I think that's one of the big questions I have as a reporter covering this is when is the science, the biological science, going to catch up with all of the technology? Because we really have not, other than, as Chris alluded to, a year on the space station. And that's still in low Earth orbit. That's not on the moon. That's not on Mars. I think there's a whole lot more work that's going to have to be done to figure out how do we survive up there.
Absolutely, and I appreciate that. And of course, we have now the advantage of the perspective of the way in which the West was won, and we can work on that as well with our earlier conversation around more inclusion and accessibility and understanding that there's the analogy of needing to survive off the land, and we can do the who gets to go part of it better because we've learned from our past actions. We probably have time for one, maybe two more questions, but I want to touch on the economy of space exploration a bit, with both of your experience and background there too. So we have a question here about this being right now about a $500 billion industry, space exploration, and how much bigger do you think it will get? What's the economics of the growth here, and where is that headed?
Yeah, well, as Brian said earlier, we focus on the billionaires and the rockets and the fire and the smoke, but a lot of what's driving it doesn't involve humans. It involves satellite technology. I think, too, that there could be an interesting revolution, not just in the satellite technology and the computing power, but in the manufacturing. And that if you can manufacture in space and mine in space, that could really open things up. I mean, Jeff Bezos talks about, space as sort of creating an economic dynamism, as we saw with the internet. But with the internet, as he would say, anybody could start an internet company in their dorm room, like Mark Zuckerberg did with Facebook, because the infrastructure was there. The phone company had laid down the cables. The post office could deliver the books for Amazon. There was this invention called the credit card that could take, people's money, and you can build on top of that infrastructure and start it. You can't do that in space today. The infrastructure is not there. It's still too prohibitively expensive. There's a reason why it's been dominated by governments. So if they can build that infrastructure, to get to space cheaply and more reliably, then there could be sort of the economic dynamism, that they saw on the internet. That remains to be seen. As I think Brian said earlier, this is it's still largely dominated by governments and government investment to a very large degree. And whether there can be a self-sustaining economy without the governments that's the big question. And then, how big that is, I guess you would need I would need a better crystal ball.
Good point. Brian, your thoughts on that evolution of this economy and where it may go and why it may go there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, all of the experts will say that it's growing. It's real growth. It's not imagined. Just in the last, 10 to 15 years, it's grown substantially, and the predictions are it will keep growing. But I do think the big test will be, as Chris alluded to, some of the big ideas like space mining. I mean, if we can really start landing spacecraft on asteroids and pulling out iron or copper or God knows what, and marketing that on Earth, then obviously you're going to enter a whole new phase of investment and a whole new economy. But I think even without some of those big ideas, even just satellite communications, and these constellations now that are going up virtually every day, of Earth observation satellites, that economy is growing in leaps and bounds. I think, as Chris also said, manufacturing will be a key. There's lots of ideas about developing pharmaceuticals in space. If there's some benefit to the zero gravity to make drugs. I mean, if you can have floating pharmaceutical labs, God knows the pharmaceutical companies will figure out how to make money off of that. So there's sort of a lot of big possibilities, but I think a lot of them are still sort of in that nascent phase where, as Chris said, you can't just put a lab in space. You need a lot of infrastructure, a lot of investment up front to build on. And I think that's what Bezos and Musk, to a lesser extent, are really thinking when they're looking long term. They realize that if you wait for the governments to do this, to build that interstate highway system, so to speak, for space, it may not happen. And so they want to sort of lay the groundwork, make it really lower cost to get to space with their rockets, have some spacecraft that can go up there and move things around, and start laying that, like I said, interstate highway system, so that we can really start to get around up there. Because right now it's still fairly limited. But like I said, a lot of big ideas.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed how we've spent time today talking about the predominantly non-human aspect of this industry and this economy. But then also touching on the fact that it's really the awe and wonder of space that then drives us to want to go, right? Today, 4 civilian astronauts are going to go to space, and all of them are wanting to do that. And some of them for a very long time have wanted to. So this idea that the economy and the growth of the space economy that you just articulated by the non-human aspects, that will really ultimately fuel an accessibility and a cost point that will then allow those that want to go. But that comes next, right? It's the underlying economics of it all that needs to make it affordable and accessible and to pay off before we really get to that being something we can do regularly. So it is a long game, as we discussed at the beginning, and it's just taking that one step at a time and bringing it closer and closer with each milestone. So thank you both for your thoughts on this. Before we adjourn today's program, we're going to hear again from Dr. Proctor about her motto of space to inspire in this vein of people wanting to go and us all wanting to be inspired by these activities. So we'll hear from her now.
One of my mottos is space to inspire. And it's this whole idea of getting people to use their unique space to inspire those within their reach and beyond. And when I'm talking about their unique space, it's the space we inhabit, the space that makes up you. You are unique and there'll only ever be one of you. And so how you use your unique strengths and your passions and your love for our amazing world is important. And it's important that you share that.
Wow, space to inspire, be you for the world. I just love that. It's wonderful. Thank you to our live audience today for your attention and your great questions on today's program. A recording of this conversation will be available for playback on the Council's social channels and on their website very shortly. I really want to extend a special thanks to Brian and Chris for joining us for the program today, sharing your insights. It was a pleasure speaking with you. I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.